Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Noam Chomsky, the architect of innate linguistic structures. Together and apart, they mapped the territories where human nature reveals itself through universal patterns, one in the realm of ancient symbols, the other in the architecture of language itself. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the question of what is born within us. One seeing archetypal images rising from depths older than memory, the other discovering grammatical structures woven into the fabric of cognition itself. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Chomsky as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. The story begins not with a meeting, for these two never sat across from one another in any consulting room or academic hall, but with two separate awakenings to the mystery of what dwells within us before experience writes upon the blank page of consciousness. In the early years of the 20th century, when Jung was beginning his descent into the layers of the psyche, the world still believed largely in the tabula rasa, the blank slate upon which culture and learning inscribed everything that made us human. And decades later, in the middle of that same century, when a young linguist named Noam Chomsky began his revolutionary work on the nature of language, the behavioral orthodoxy still held firm to the belief that all human capacity emerged from conditioning, from the careful arrangement of rewards and punishments upon an essentially empty vessel. But both men, in their separate domains and with vastly different tools, would come to challenge this emptiness. Both would propose instead that we are born bearing within us deep structures, patterns woven into our very being before we draw our first breath or speak our first word. For Jung, these structures manifested as archetypes, primordial images that shaped our dreams, our myths, our religions, and our most profound psychological experiences. For Chomsky, these structures revealed themselves in the universal grammar underlying all human languages, the innate capacity that allows a child to master the bewildering complexity of syntax and semantics with an ease that no blank slate could explain. Let us begin with Jung, as we must, for he is the shore against which all others are measured in these nocturnal explorations. By the time Chomsky was born in 1928, Jung was already 53 years old, well into his mature period, having long since broken with Freud and established his own school of analytical psychology. But to understand Jung's vision of the innate structures of the psyche, we must return to an earlier moment, to the years of crisis and transformation that followed his split from Freud in 1913. Those years, which Jung would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, were marked by a descent into what might have been madness or might have been prophetic vision, depending on how one chose to interpret the strange images and voices that flooded his inner world. He withdrew from much of his professional life and devoted himself to the careful recording of fantasies, visions, and dreams. He filled notebook after notebook with images that seemed to rise from nowhere, from no personal memory or experience he could identify. They were mandalas, circular forms suggesting wholeness and completion. There were figures he came to call archetypal: the wise old man, the great mother, the shadow, the anima. There were mythological motifs that he discovered, to his astonishment, in cultures and times far removed from his own Swiss upbringing. This was the crucial discovery that would shape everything that followed. These images were not personal. They could not be reduced to his individual history, to repressed memories or childhood traumas. Instead, they seemed to belong to a deeper layer of the psyche, one that was shared, collective, universal. Just as all human beings share a common biological structure, with hearts and lungs and nervous systems organized according to the same fundamental plan, so too, Jung proposed, do all human beings share a common psychological structure, with archetypal patterns that organize and shape our inner experience. The collective unconscious, as he named it, was not learned. It was not transmitted through culture or language or teaching. It was inherited, built into the very structure of the human brain, the residue of countless generations of human experience crystallized into forms that recur again and again across cultures and throughout history. The hero's journey, the creation myth, the figure of the divine child, the apocalyptic vision, these were not invented anew by each culture, but rather discovered within. Expressions of psychological structures as universal as the capacity for language itself. And here, though they would never meet and indeed moved in entirely different intellectual worlds, Jung's insight touches the territory that Chomsky would later explore with such revolutionary effect. Both men would propose that what is most distinctively human about us is not learned but given, not acquired but innate, not cultural but biological. The structures were different, one symbolic and imaginal, the other grammatical and logical, but the fundamental insight was parallel. We are not blank slates. We come into the world already prepared, already structured, already equipped with patterns that shape how we will encounter and make sense of experience. Jung spent the 1920s and 30s elaborating this vision. He traveled to Africa, to India, to the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, seeking evidence of archetypal patterns in cultures untouched by European influence. He studied alchemy, Gnosticism, Eastern philosophy, comparative mythology, looking always for the recurring symbols, the universal images that suggested a common psychic substrate beneath the diversity of cultural expression. He worked with patients whose dreams and fantasies spontaneously produced imagery they could not have, learned symbols from myths they had never encountered, mandalas drawn by individuals who had never seen a Buddhist mandala in their lives. His writing from this period, dense and elusive and often frustratingly imprecise, attempted to map this territory of the collective unconscious to show how the archetypes manifested in individual psychology, in cultural phenomena, in artistic creation, in religious experience. The archetypes, he insisted, were not fixed images, but rather patterns of possibility, forms of potential experience that took on specific content according to individual and cultural context. The Great Mother archetype might appear in one dream as the Virgin Mary, in another as the Hindu goddess Kali, in another as an individual's actual mother enlarged to mythic proportions. The pattern was constant even as the particular manifestation varied. Critics often found Jung's work maddeningly vague, too ready to find patterns where none existed, too willing to leap from a few similar images in different cultures to grand pronouncements about universal structures. How could he prove the existence of archetypes? How could he demonstrate that these patterns were truly innate rather than the result of cultural diffusion or common human experiences like birth, death, and sexuality? Jung's response was always empirical in his own fashion. Look at the dreams. Look at the myths. Look at the spontaneous imagery produced by individuals who could not have learned these symbols through any normal channel. The proof was in the recurrence, in the numinous quality of archetypal experience, in the way these images gripped the psyche with a power that personal memories alone could not explain. By the 1950s, when Chomsky was beginning his graduate work in linguistics, Jung was in his 70s, his major theoretical work complete, increasingly focused on the spiritual dimensions of analytical psychology and the connections between his depth psychology and Eastern thought. His concept of the collective unconscious had found a following, particularly among those drawn to the intersection of psychology and spirituality, but it remained controversial within academic psychology, too mystical for the empiricists, too Eurocentric for the cultural relativists, too willing to blur the boundaries between psychology and religion for the secular materialists. Jung's vision of innate psychological structures existed in a strange twilight zone, respected by many, but not fully integrated into the mainstream of psychological science. And this was the intellectual landscape when a young linguist in Cambridge, Massachusetts, began developing ideas that would eventually revolutionize not just linguistics, but cognitive science more broadly. Ideas that would provide a very different answer to the question of what structures are given to us by our biological heritage. Avram Noam Chomsky was born in Philadelphia on December 7th, 1928, to Jewish immigrant parents deeply engaged in education and social justice. His father, William Chomsky, was a Hebrew scholar, and the young Noam grew up in an environment where language was not just a tool for communication, but an object of study, reverence, and delight. From an early age, he was exposed to questions about linguistic structure, about the relationship between language and thought, about the patterns that made meaning possible. But the intellectual world that Chomsky entered as a graduate student in linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania in the late 1940s was dominated by an approach utterly at odds with any notion of innate structures. Behaviorism, which had risen to dominance in American psychology in the 20s and 30s, insisted that all learning, including language learning, could be explained through conditioning, through the association of stimuli and responses, through the gradual shaping of behavior, through reward and punishment. B. F. Skinner, the most prominent and influential behaviorist of the mid-20th century, had extended this framework explicitly to language in his work on verbal behavior. According to Skinner's model, children learn to speak through exactly the same mechanisms that rats learn to press levers in laboratory experiments. When a child made a sound that resembled a word, caregivers provided positive reinforcement, and gradually, through countless repetitions and refinements, the child's vocalizations were shaped into meaningful language. There was no need to posit any special language faculty, any innate grammatical knowledge. The blank slate, given sufficient exposure and reinforcement, could learn anything, including the complexities of human language. This was the orthodoxy against which Chomsky would rebel, but his rebellion was not motivated by mysticism or a desire to preserve some notion of human specialness against reductionist science. On the contrary, Chomsky's revolution would be rigorously logical, mathematically sophisticated, and grounded in careful, empirical observation of linguistic facts. His argument against the blank slate came not from intuition but from close attention to what children actually do when they learn language. The crucial insight came to Chomsky as he studied the formal properties of different types of grammars, using tools from mathematical logic and computation theory. He recognized that the grammar of human languages, the system of rules that allows us to construct and understand an infinite variety of sentences, was vastly more complex than anything that could be learned through simple association and reinforcement. The gap between the linguistic input that a child receives fragmentary, error-ridden, limited in scope, and the linguistic competence that the child develops systematic, creative, capable of producing and understanding sentences never before encountered, was simply too vast to be bridged by behaviorist learning mechanisms. This became known as the poverty of the stimulus argument. Children master language with remarkable speed and uniformity, converging on complex grammatical rules despite receiving wildly different linguistic input of highly variable quality. They make creative errors that reveal underlying rule systems rather than simple imitation. They know things about their language that they could not have learned from the evidence available to them. The only explanation, Chomsky argued, was that they bring to the task of language learning a specialized cognitive capacity, an innate endowment of linguistic knowledge that guides and constrains the learning process. In 1957, Chomsky published Syntactic Structures, a slim volume that would fundamentally transform linguistics and eventually influence fields far beyond it. In this work, and the writings that followed throughout the 60s and 70s, Chomsky developed the theory of generative grammar, a formal system designed to capture the implicit knowledge that underlies linguistic competence. At the heart of this theory was the concept of universal grammar, the set of principles and parameters that all human languages share, the innate linguistic endowment that makes language learning possible. Here, then, was a proposal about innate psychological structures that bore a striking superficial resemblance to Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. Just as Jung had argued that all humans inherit archetypal patterns that shape psychological experience, Chomsky argued that all humans inherit grammatical principles that shape linguistic capacity. Just as Jung's archetypes were said to manifest in culturally specific forms while retaining universal structure, Chomsky's universal grammar was said to allow for the diversity of human languages while constraining them all within certain fundamental parameters. Just as Jung saw archetypal experience as something that emerged spontaneously and powerfully in dreams and fantasies, Chomsky saw grammatical knowledge as something that emerged spontaneously and powerfully in childhood language acquisition. But here, at the very point where their ideas seemed to converge, the profound differences in their approaches became clear. For Chomsky's innate structures were not symbols or images or meaningful forms. They were abstract principles, logical rules, formal constraints. Universal grammar was not something one could visualize or experience directly. It had no numinous quality, no mythic resonance. It was, in Chomsky's framework, a computational system, a set of procedures for manipulating symbols according to rules, a mental organ as biologically grounded as the liver or the heart, but with no more emotional or spiritual significance than those organs. Chomsky's revolution, which became known as the cognitive revolution, was explicitly a rejection of behaviorism, but also, more quietly, a rejection of the kind of depth psychology that Jung represented. Where behaviorism had reduced the mind to a passive responder to external stimuli, cognitive science proposed an active information processor, a system that transformed inputs according to internal rules and representations. But these internal rules and representations were, in Chomsky's framework, entirely rational, entirely within the domain of logic and computation. There was no place in this system for the unconscious in Jung's sense, no depth dimension where symbols emerged from mythic sources, no collective inheritance of meaningful images. Indeed, Chomsky was quite explicit in his dismissals of psychoanalytic approaches, including those influenced by Jung. In various writings and interviews over the decades, he characterized psychoanalysis as unscientific, based on untestable claims and interpretive methods that could find confirmation for any theory in any data. The unconscious, for Chomsky, if it existed at all, was simply those aspects of mental processing that were not available to introspection, the computational rules that operated below the threshold of awareness, but that could be discovered through rigorous linguistic analysis. It was not a realm of symbols, archetypes, or repressed desires, but simply the domain of mental processes that happened to be inaccessible to conscious report. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, as Chomsky's influence spread beyond linguistics into psychology, philosophy, and the emerging field of cognitive science, and as Jung's ideas gained popular currency through the work of followers like Joseph Campbell and James Hillman, these two visions of innate structures coexisted in separate intellectual worlds. They rarely engaged directly. Chomsky's work was too technical, too formal, too grounded in linguistic details to attract much attention from Jungian analysts. And Jung's work was too imprecise, too willing to embrace paradox and ambiguity, too saturated with spiritual and mythological content to interest cognitive scientists. Yet there were occasional moments of intersection, places where the question arose: are these two thinkers describing different aspects of the same underlying reality, or fundamentally incompatible visions of human nature? In the study of metaphor, for instance, some linguists, influenced by Chomsky's work, began exploring how metaphorical thinking revealed deep structures of cognition. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, in their 1980 book, Metaphors We Live By, argued that metaphor was not mere ornamentation, but rather structured thought at a fundamental level, with basic metaphors like time is money or argument is war, shaping how we reason and act. This work, while rooted in cognitive linguistics, opened questions about meaning and imagination that resonated with Jungian concerns, even as the methodology remained thoroughly within the cognitive paradigm. Jung died in 1961, when Chomsky was 32, and at the height of his early influence. Chomsky, now in his 90s as of this recording, has lived long enough to see his own theories challenged, revised, extended, and debated across multiple generations of linguists and cognitive scientists. The story of their relationship is not a story of influence or dialogue, but rather of parallel paths, of two attempts to answer the same fundamental question: what is given to us by our nature as human beings, through radically different lenses. To understand the depth of their differences and the intriguing points of resonance, we must now turn to a more detailed comparison of their core concepts, examining how each would have understood the phenomena that concerned the other, exploring the different languages they use to describe what might, in some cases, be the same underlying features of the human mind. Let us begin with the concept of structure itself. for this is the common ground from which all other comparisons must proceed. Both Jung and Chomsky insisted, against the prevailing empiricist and behaviorist orthodoxies of their times, that the mind is not a blank slate, but comes into the world already organized, already patterned, already prepared to encounter experience in particular ways. But the nature of these structures, the way they function, and the type of content they involve differed profoundly between the two thinkers. For Jung, structure was inseparable from meaning. The archetypes were not empty forms, but patterns saturated with significance, with emotional tone, with mythological resonance. When Jung described the archetype of the Great Mother, he was not simply describing an abstract pattern, but a complex of feelings, images, and potentials for relationship that shaped how an individual experienced motherhood, femininity, nurture, and the unconscious itself. The archetype carried within it both creative and destructive possibilities, the loving mother and the devouring mother, the life-giver and the one who holds too tight, the source of comfort and the overwhelming, engulfing presence. This archetypal structure manifested in dreams, in fantasies, in symptoms, in artistic creations, always clothed in specific images drawn from the individual's cultural context and personal experience, but always revealing beneath these specific manifestations a universal pattern. A European might dream of the Virgin Mary, an Indian of the goddess Durga, a modern secular person of an idealized or terrifying biological mother. But in each case, Jung argued, the same archetypal structure was at work, the same deep pattern rising from the collective unconscious. The function of these archetypal structures was not simply cognitive, but transformative. When an individual encountered an archetype, whether in a dream or a religious experience or a psychological crisis, something shifted in the psyche. The encounter was numinous, carrying a charge of meaning and emotion that exceeded any rational explanation. The archetypes guided the individuation process, Jung's term for psychological development and self-realization, presenting challenges and possibilities that pushed consciousness toward greater wholeness and integration. Crucially, the archetypes could not be known directly. They were not contents of consciousness, but rather forms that shaped content, potentials that required concrete realization. Jung often compared them to the axial system of a crystal, which determines the pattern of crystallization but is itself invisible in the crystal itself. Or he compared them to empty riverbed, channels carved by repeated experiences over evolutionary time, that guide the flow of psychic energy into characteristic patterns. Now consider Chomsky's understanding of structure. Universal grammar, the innate linguistic endowment that Chomsky proposed, consisted of a set of principles and parameters that constrained and guided language. Acquisition. These principles were formal, abstract, and entirely devoid of semantic content in themselves. They were rules about rules, constraints on possible grammars rather than actual grammars themselves. For example, one of the principles that Chomsky proposed was structure dependence, the idea that grammatical rules operate on hierarchical structures rather than linear sequences of words. When English speakers form questions by moving auxiliary verbs, we say, "Is John leaving?" rather than "John is leaving." But we don't simply move the first auxiliary verb in the sentence. If the sentence is, "The man who is tall is leaving," we form the question as, "Is the man who is tall leaving?" not, "Is the man who tall is leaving?" We somehow know, without being taught, that the relevant structure is the hierarchical organization of phrases, not the linear order of words. This knowledge, Chomsky argued, could not be learned from experience because children are never explicitly taught such. Principles and the evidence available to them underdetermines which hypothesis about language structure is correct. Therefore, the principle of structure dependence must be innate, part of the universal grammar that all children bring to the task of language learning. But notice that this principle has no meaning beyond its formal properties. It doesn't symbolize anything. It doesn't carry emotional weight. It doesn't transform consciousness. It simply constrains which grammatical systems are possible for human languages. The parameters in Chomsky's theory were settings that could vary from language to language, but in ways constrained by universal grammar. For instance, some languages allow the subject of a sentence to be omitted when it's understood from context, while others require explicit subjects. This is a parameter that children must set based on the language they hear around them, but the range of possible settings is innate. The child doesn't have to consider infinite possible ways that languages might work. The parameter is already there, requiring only exposure to evidence to flip the switch one way or another. Here, then, we see structures that guide development, but in a completely different register from Jung's archetypes. Chomsky's universal grammar shapes linguistic competence through logical constraints. Jung's archetypes shape psychological experience through meaningful images. Chomsky's structures operate in the domain of syntax and phonology. Jung's structures operate in the domain of myth and symbol. Chomsky's principles are discovered through linguistic analysis. Jung's archetypes are encountered through depth exploration of dreams and fantasies. Yet there is a curious parallel in how both thinkers understood the relationship between universal structures and particular manifestations. Just as a single Jungian archetype could manifest in countless culturally specific forms while retaining its underlying pattern, a single parameter setting in Chomsky's universal grammar could generate an enormous variety of sentences while constraining what counts as grammatical. The creativity in both systems came not from the structures themselves, but from the interaction between innate structure and experience, between universal pattern and particular content. Consider linguistic creativity, which became central to Chomsky's argument against behaviorism. One of his most powerful points was that competent speakers can produce and understand sentences they have never heard before. The number of possible sentences in a language is infinite, yet speakers effortlessly generate and comprehend novel utterances all the time. This creativity, Chomsky argued, was only possible because speakers had internalized a generative grammar, a finite system of rules that could produce an infinite array of structures. But Chomsky was careful to distinguish this linguistic creativity from what he called creativity in the ordinary sense. Linguistic creativity was simply the normal use of language, the everyday ability to express new thoughts in new combinations of words. It was rule-governed and universal. Creativity in the ordinary sense, artistic creation, scientific discovery, original thought remained mysterious to Chomsky and largely outside the domain he sought to explain. He was interested in linguistic competence, not in how people use that competence to write poetry or formulate new ideas. Jung, by contrast, placed creativity at the very center of his psychology. For Jung, the creative process was intimately connected with the encounter with archetypal material, the great artist, the religious prophet, the dreamer who touched depths within themselves. All were drawing from the collective unconscious, bringing archetypal images and patterns into conscious form. This was not rule-governed, but rather imaginal, symbolic, transformative. The creativity Jung valued was precisely the kind that Chomsky set aside as beyond the scope of his theory. Here we find one of the deepest divergences between the two thinkers. Chomsky's revolution was fundamentally rationalist. He restored to the mind an active, structuring role that behaviorism had denied. But the structures he proposed were logical, computational, formal. His vision of human nature emphasized our rational cognitive capacities, our ability to master complex abstract systems, our possession of a powerful computational mechanism in the language faculty. There was, in Chomsky's framework, no necessary connection between this capacity and what we might call the soul, or meaning, or depth experience. Jung's vision, by contrast, was fundamentally romantic in the sense of emphasizing imagination, emotion, and the irrational dimensions of psyche. His archetypes were not computational structures but living potentials, not rules but images, not logical but symbolic. Where Chomsky saw in innate structures evidence of our nature as rational animals, Jung saw evidence of our nature as symbolic animals, meaning seeking creatures whose deepest experiences involved encounters with dimensions of existence that exceeded rational understanding. The different entry points into psychological understanding reflect these fundamentally different orientations. Chomsky came to his insights through the formal analysis of linguistic data, through careful attention to grammatical structures and their properties. He asked questions like, what rules must a child have internalized to be able to generate this type of sentence? What principles constrain the range of possible grammatical transformations? His method was analytical, breaking complex phenomena down into component parts and rules. Jung came to his insights through what he called active imagination and the analysis of dream symbolism through descent into the imaginal realm. He asked questions like, what does this image want from the dreamer? What transformation is trying to occur through this symptom? What myth is this person living? His method was synthetic and hermeneutic, seeking patterns of meaning and following the symbolic logic of the unconscious. Their different relationships with their subjects or patients reflected these methodological differences. Chomsky studied linguistic performance as a window into linguistic competence, but he was not particularly interested in speakers as individuals. His concern was with the abstract system that all speakers shared, not with personal variations or individual creativity. He often used invented example sentences to make his points, and his arguments proceeded through logical demonstration rather than through accumulated case studies. Jung, by contrast, spent decades in intense therapeutic relationships with individuals, listening to their dreams, exploring their fantasies, witnessing their transformations. His case studies, while often criticized for lack of rigor by empirical standards, were rich, phenomenological accounts of how archetypal material emerged in individual lives. The person was never reducible to an instance of universal principles, but was rather a unique individual whose particular constellation of archetypal patterns created an irreplaceable story. Yet here again we find a subtle parallel beneath the obvious differences. Both thinkers insisted that what was most universal in human nature revealed itself through careful attention to particulars. Chomsky studied specific languages, specific sentence types, specific grammatical phenomena, always seeking beneath them the universal principles that made them possible. Jung studied specific dreams, specific patients, specific myths, always seeking beneath them the universal archetypes that animated them. Neither was content with surface description. Both sought deep structures, patterns that were not immediately visible but that explained the phenomena they studied. The question of content versus form becomes crucial here. Chomsky's linguistic structures were entirely formal. Universal grammar said nothing about what people should talk about, what meanings they should express, what concepts their language should encode. It only constrained the formal structures through which any content whatsoever would be expressed. This meant that Chomsky's theory maintained a strict separation between syntax and semantics, between the structures of language and the meanings conveyed through language. While he acknowledged that studying semantics was important, his primary focus was on syntax, and his most influential work concerned the formal properties of grammatical systems. Jung's archetypal structures, by contrast, were already meaningful. The archetype of the hero, for instance, was not an empty form that could take on any content whatsoever, but rather a pattern inherently involving themes of challenge, transformation, struggle, and achievement. The specific details varied. One culture's hero might be a warrior, another's a spiritual seeker, another's a revolutionary, but the underlying pattern carried meaning built into its very structure. There was no neat separation between form and content in Jung's system, because the archetypes were patterns of meaning, not abstract rules. This difference reveals contrasting assumptions about the relationship between biology and meaning. For Chomsky, our biological inheritance included sophisticated cognitive capacities but no particular meanings or values. Natural selection had endowed us with a language faculty because linguistic communication provided adaptive advantages, but the content of what we communicated remained entirely open, determined by culture and individual choice. The universal structures shaped how we could think and speak, not what we should think or speak about. For Jung, the biological inheritance ran deeper into the realm of meaning itself. The archetypes were not just cognitive capacities, but value-laden patterns, images that already pointed towards certain orientations in life. The hero archetype, the wise old man, the great mother, these were not neutral structures but patterns that embodied significance, that carried within them intimations of what mattered, what called for response, what demanded transformation. Jung's psychology was thoroughly teleological, oriented toward purposes and meanings, while Chomsky's linguistics was mechanistic, concerned with causes and structures. The implications of this difference become clearer when we consider how each thinker understood development. For Chomsky, language acquisition was a process of parameter setting guided by universal grammar. The child was born with the full complement of linguistic principles already in place. Experience served only to trigger the maturation of the language faculty and to set parameters to match the ambient language. There was no teleology here, no end state toward which the child was developing beyond linguistic competence itself. Once a child had acquired their native language, the acquisition process was essentially complete. Additional languages could be learned, vocabulary could expand, stylistic sophistication could develop, but these were secondary accomplishments built on the foundation of the already mastered universal grammar. For Jung, psychological development was a lifelong process of individuation, the gradual realization of the self, the fullest expression of one's unique potentials, while integrating the archetypal patterns of the collective unconscious. The journey was toward wholeness, toward the integration of conscious and unconscious, toward the reconciliation of opposites, toward becoming who one most truly was. This was not a mechanical process, but a meaningful one, often marked by crises and breakthroughs, by encounters with archetypes that demanded transformation, by dreams and synchronicities that pointed toward necessary changes. The endpoint of individuation, for Jung, was not simply the mastery of some capacity, but rather a state of being, what he called the realization of the self archetype. The self represented the totality of the psyche, the organizing center that transcended and included consciousness and unconscious alike. The symbols of the self, the mandala, the divine child, the wise old man, the reconciliation of opposites appeared in dreams and religious experiences across cultures, pointing toward this goal of psychic wholeness. Chomsky would have found such language meaningless, or at best metaphorical. His concerns were not with states of being or spiritual wholeness, but with cognitive capacities and their acquisition. The question of what made a life meaningful, what purposes were worth pursuing, what constituted psychological health, these lay entirely outside his theoretical framework. They were important questions, certainly, questions that Chomsky himself engaged as a political activist and moral philosopher, but they were not questions that his theory of universal grammar was designed to address. Yet precisely here, at the point of greatest divergence, we might ask whether these two thinkers were simply operating in completely separate domains, or whether they were emphasizing different aspects of a more comprehensive understanding of human nature. Is it possible that we are born with both innate cognitive structures of the sort Chomsky described and innate patterns of meaning of the sort Jung proposed? Might there be room in a complete theory of the human mind for both universal grammar and universal archetypes, both formal constraints on language and imaginal patterns that shape experience? Some contemporary psychologists and philosophers have suggested that these frameworks might be complementary rather than contradictory. Chomsky's work explains our capacity for linguistic communication, but not the content of what we find meaningful to communicate. Jung's work explores the dimensions of meaning and value that guide human striving, but does not pretend to explain the formal mechanisms of cognition. Perhaps both are needed. Perhaps the human being is simultaneously a rational information processor and a symbolic meaning seeker, and any complete psychology must do justice to both dimensions. But such an attempted synthesis must reckon with the methodological incompatibility between the two approaches. Chomsky's linguistics proceeds through formal analysis, mathematical modeling, and the careful testing of theoretical predictions against linguistic data. The criteria for a good theory in Chomskyan linguistics are precision, explanatory power, and parsimony. Vague claims, unfalsifiable hypotheses, and appeals to subjective experience are exactly what Chomsky's cognitive revolution was designed to move beyond. Jung's analytical psychology proceeds through interpretation of symbolic material, hermeneutic engagement with meaning, and phenomenological description of inner experience. The criteria for a good interpretation in Jungian psychology are depth, resonance, and transformative power. Reductionist explanations that miss the meaning of experience, formal models that fail to capture the living reality of psychological process, and mechanical theories that ignore the soul, these are exactly what Jung's depth psychology was designed to transcend. To imagine a conversation between Chomsky and Jung, then, is to imagine a conversation between fundamentally incommensurable orientations toward the psyche. Chomsky might say, "Show me the evidence for archetypes. Define your terms precisely. How would we test whether a particular image is archetypal or merely learned? What predictions does your theory make that could be falsified? Without such rigor, how is this different from reading tea leaves, finding patterns that exist primarily in the interpreter's imagination?" Jung might respond, "You have mapped the skeleton of language but missed its flesh and blood. What matters to human beings is not the formal structure of their sentences, but the meanings they struggle to express. the stories they need to tell, the depths they must explore to become whole. Your universal grammar explains syntax but tells us nothing about why we speak, what we long to say, or what silences haunt us. You have given us a cognitive mechanism but forgotten the soul. Yet, if we listen carefully to this imagined dialogue, we might detect moments where the two thinkers could recognize something in each other's work, however grudgingly. Chomsky might acknowledge that the question of what makes certain narratives compelling across cultures is interesting, even if he would insist on investigating it through empirical means rather than archetypal speculation. Perhaps there are universal patterns in the stories humans tell, rooted in common experiences of birth, death, conflict, and relationship, which could be studied scientifically without recourse to collective unconscious. Jung might acknowledge that his emphasis on symbol and meaning should not blind us to the importance of studying the formal structures of mind. Perhaps understanding how the brain processes information, how language faculty develops, how cognitive mechanisms operate, provides crucial constraints on theories of depth psychology. Perhaps some of what Jung attributed to archetypal activity might be better understood as the operation of universal cognitive structures, though Jung would insist that this understanding could never exhaust the meaning of symbolic experience. Consider how each thinker might approach the phenomenon of myth, a domain where their concerns most clearly overlap. For Jung, myths were perhaps the purest expressions of archetypal material, collective narratives that gave shape to the fundamental patterns of psychological experience. The hero's journey, as elaborated by Joseph Campbell, following Jung's insights, appeared in virtually every mythological tradition because it expressed an archetypal pattern of psychological development. The call to adventure, the crossing of the threshold, the trials and challenges, the ultimate boon, the return and integration. This pattern recurred because it reflected something true about the process of psychological transformation. The journey from ego consciousness through an encounter with the unconscious and back again changed and deepened. The details varied enormously from culture to culture. The hero might be male or female, divine or human, historical or purely mythical. The challenges might involve monsters or riddles, battles or temptations, physical ordeals or spiritual tests. But beneath this variation, Jung saw a constant pattern, the archetypal structure of transformation shining through diverse cultural expressions. Chomsky's approach to myth would be very different. He might note that myths, like all linguistic productions, must conform to the constraints of universal grammar. The sentences that comprise a myth must respect structure dependence, must organize phrases hierarchically, must conform to whatever parameter settings are appropriate for the language in which the myth is told. But these formal constraints tell us nothing about the content of myths, nothing about why certain stories recur or what makes them compelling. Content, for Chomsky, is not the domain of linguistics but of other disciplines, anthropology, cognitive science, evolutionary psychology, perhaps. If pressed to explain the cross-cultural recurrence of similar mythic motifs, Chomsky might point to common human experiences and common evolutionary heritage without invoking anything like a collective unconscious. All humans are born helpless and dependent. All experience separation from caregivers. All face challenges and conflicts. All must navigate social hierarchies. All will eventually die. It would be surprising if stories addressing these universal human concerns did not share certain features. Moreover, human cultures have been in contact throughout history, diffusing ideas and narratives through trade and conquest and migration. What appears to be independent invention might often be cultural transmission lost to historical memory. Jung would counter that such explanations miss what is most essential about myths: their numinous quality, their power to grip the psyche and catalyze transformation. A myth is not just a story about common human experiences, but a living symbol, a window into depths that rational analysis cannot reach. When a person encounters a myth that speaks to their condition, something shifts at a level deeper than intellectual understanding. The myth resonates because it touches archetypal structures within, because it provides a pattern through which the person can understand and navigate their own psychological journey. Here, the conversation would likely reach an impasse. Chomsky would insist that powerful subjective experiences do not constitute evidence for theoretical claims. Jung would insist that approaches that exclude such experiences from consideration have already missed what matters most. The gap between them reflects not just different theories, but different values, different convictions about what counts as knowledge, different orientations toward what it means to understand the human being. Yet the fact that both insisted on innate, universal structures, however differently they conceive them, sets them apart from many other 20th century thinkers. Both rejected the blank slate. Both proposed that we come into the world already prepared, already structured, already possessing patterns that will shape our engagement with experience. In an intellectual climate dominated by the view that everything important about human beings was learned, both Chomsky and Jung dared to propose that some of what makes us human is given, not acquired. This shared commitment to innateness had profound implications for how each thinker understood human universality and human difference. If we all share universal grammar, then at a deep level, all human languages are fundamentally similar despite their surface differences. The apparent diversity of languages, different sound systems, different word orders, different ways of marking grammatical relations, reflects only the surface settings of parameters, while the underlying principles remain constant. This means that any child can learn any language, that no language is fundamentally harder or easier than any other, that linguistic diversity does not reflect deeper cognitive differences between populations. Similarly, if we all share the same archetypal structures in the collective unconscious, then at a deep level, all human psychological experiences draw from a common source. The apparent diversity of cultural expressions, religious systems, mythological traditions reflects only surface variations, while the underlying patterns remain constant. This means that cross-cultural understanding is possible, that we can recognize ourselves in the myths and symbols of distant cultures, that psychological diversity does not reflect fundamentally different types of human psyches. Both conclusions were profoundly egalitarian in their implications, insisting on a fundamental human unity that transcended cultural differences. Yet both also had to grapple with a charge of imperialism, of imposing categories derived from one cultural context onto all others. Critics argued that Chomsky's universal grammar reflected the structures of Indo-European languages, and that his supposedly universal principles might simply be artifacts of the limited linguistic data he considered. Critics argued that Jung's archetypes reflected European mythology, and that his supposedly universal symbols might simply be projections of Western cultural assumptions onto other traditions. Both Chomsky and Jung took these criticisms seriously, but ultimately remained convinced that their proposed universals were real. Chomsky pointed to linguistic research on an ever-widening range of languages, including many with grammatical structures radically different from English, arguing that the more we learned about linguistic diversity, the more we saw evidence for underlying unity. Jung pointed to his comparative studies of mythology and religion, his encounters with non-European cultures, his work with patients from diverse backgrounds, arguing that archetypal patterns emerged spontaneously even in individuals with no knowledge of the myths that express them. The question of whether their proposed universals were real discoveries or theoretical impositions remains contested. What is clear is that both thinkers transformed their fields by insisting that some structures were indeed universal, that beneath apparent diversity lay patterns worthy of investigation and reflection. Let us turn now to the question of the unconscious, for here the differences between Chomsky and Jung become particularly stark. The unconscious was, of course, central to Jung's entire project. His break with Freud had been partly over the nature and contents of the unconscious. Where Freud had seen the unconscious as essentially personal, consisting of repressed wishes and traumatic memories, Jung proposed two layers: the personal unconscious, which did consist of forgotten or repressed material from an individual's life, and the collective unconscious, which was not personal at all, but rather the inherited substrate of archetypal patterns shared by all humanity. The collective unconscious was not unconscious in the sense of having once been conscious and then forgotten or repressed. It was never conscious to begin with. It could not be made fully conscious because it was not content but structure, not images in themselves, but the patterns that shaped images. What could become conscious were the specific manifestations of archetypes in dreams, fantasies, symptoms, and creative works. But the archetypes themselves remained in the depths, like the roots of a tree that support and nourish what appears above ground, but are never themselves visible in the light. Jung spent decades exploring the dynamics of the unconscious, the ways archetypal material emerged into consciousness, the psychological processes of compensation and compensation through which the unconscious responded to one-sided conscious attitudes, the numinous experiences that occurred when consciousness encountered powerful archetypal energies, the stages of individuation through which increasing portions of the unconscious were integrated into conscious awareness without ever exhausting the depths from which they came. For Chomsky, the term unconscious, if used at all, meant something entirely different and vastly more limited. There was, in his framework, no depth dimension, no collective layer, no symbolic content waiting to emerge from hidden sources. What was unconscious was simply the computational processing that underlay linguistic competence. Speakers were not consciously aware of the rules of grammar they followed or the principles of universal grammar they instantiated, but these were not repressed or hidden in any dynamic sense. They were simply not the kind of thing that could be introspected. Just as one cannot directly observe the processes by which the visual system extracts edges and contours from patterns of light on the retina, one cannot directly observe the processes by which the language faculty generates grammatical structures. This was sometimes called tacit knowledge, knowledge that manifested in our ability to do something, to perform some cognitive task, without our being able to articulate the rules we were following. A native speaker knows intuitively whether a sentence is grammatical, but typically cannot explain why. This intuitive knowledge was unconscious only in the minimal sense of not being available to conscious report, not in any of the rich, dynamic senses that depth psychology had developed. Moreover, for Chomsky, making this tacit knowledge explicit was precisely what linguistic theory aimed to do. The linguist's job was to articulate the rules and principles that speakers followed unconsciously, to bring to conscious theoretical awareness what operated below the threshold of ordinary introspection. There was no reason to think this knowledge needed to remain unconscious, no resistance preventing it from becoming conscious, no danger or power associated with its emergence into awareness. It was simply a matter of developing the right theoretical tools and doing the careful analytical work required to make the implicit explicit. Jung would have found such a conception of the unconscious impoverished, missing entirely the qualities that made depth psychology necessary. The unconscious, for Jung, was not a computational mechanism, but a living reality, a dimension of the psyche with its own intelligence, its own purposes, its own ways of communicating through symbols. Dreams were not random firings of neurons, but meaningful messages from the unconscious, compensatory responses to conscious attitudes, warnings, suggestions, revelations. The unconscious was not merely unknown, but other, a presence within the psyche that could surprise, challenge, and transform the ego. To encounter the unconscious in Jung's sense was to undergo an experience, not to grasp a theory. It was to be gripped by an image, to be moved by a symbol, to feel the numinous power of something emerging from depths one did not control. The ego did not rule the psyche, but was rather one component in a larger system, and individuation required learning to relate to the unconscious, to listen to its communications, to integrate its contents without being overwhelmed by them. Chomsky's cognitive approach left no room for such notions. The language faculty was not other, but simply a component of the mind, a computational system that did its job of generating grammatical structures without needing to be personified or related to, as though it had autonomous purposes. The idea that the unconscious could communicate through symbols would have struck Chomsky as a category mistake, a confusion between metaphorical language and literal description. Yet here again, beneath the obvious differences, a question arises. Chomsky emphasized that linguistic competence vastly exceeded what speakers could consciously articulate. We know far more about our language than we can say we know. This knowledge is implicit, operative, effective, but not conscious. Similarly, Jung emphasized that archetypal patterns structured psychological experience far beyond what individuals consciously recognized. We are shaped by archetypes in ways we rarely consciously understand. Might there be some commonality here, some shared recognition that the mind operates on principles and patterns that exceed conscious grasp? The crucial difference is that for Jung, becoming aware of unconscious patterns was itself transformative. The process of making the unconscious conscious was not a neutral intellectual exercise, but a dangerous and necessary journey. Confronting one's shadow, integrating one's anima or animus, encountering the self, these were not matters of acquiring information, but of psychological transformation, of dying to old identities and being reborn to new ones. The unconscious had power, autonomy, and purpose in Jung's framework, qualities entirely absent from Chomsky's notion of tacit knowledge. We might say that Chomsky offered a thin theory of the unconscious, focused narrowly on computational processes that happen to be inaccessible to introspection, while Jung offered a thick theory of the unconscious, dense with meaning, purpose, and transformative potential. The question of which theory is more adequate depends on what phenomena we are trying to explain. If our concern is linguistic competence, Chomsky's thin theory may be sufficient. If our concern is the full range of psychological experience, including dreams, symptoms, creative inspiration, and spiritual transformation, Jung's thick theory may be necessary. Consider the phenomenon of creativity, which both thinkers addressed but from vastly different angles. We have already noted Chomsky's distinction between linguistic creativity, the everyday ability to produce novel sentences, and creativity in the ordinary sense, the rare ability to produce original art, science, or philosophy. Linguistic creativity was, for Chomsky, completely explained by universal grammar. Given the finite system of rules that constitutes one's linguistic competence, one can generate an infinite array of novel utterances. This capacity is universal, unconscious, and arises spontaneously in every normal child. Creativity in the ordinary sense remained mysterious to Chomsky. He often said that we have no scientific theory of how truly creative work occurs, how Newton arrived at his laws or Shakespeare composed his plays. It might be that such creativity would forever elude systematic explanation, that it represented a kind of freedom, a capacity to transcend deterministic patterns in ways that science could not capture. Chomsky the rationalist and Chomsky the libertarian political philosopher converged here, both emphasizing dimensions of human capacity that exceeded mechanistic explanation. Jung, by contrast, placed creativity at the very center of his psychological system and offered a specific theory of its source. Great creative works, Jung argued, emerged from the artist's encounter with archetypal material from the collective unconscious. The creative individual was somehow more permeable to the unconscious than ordinary persons, more able to allow archetypal images and energies to rise into consciousness and take form in art, literature, music, or other media. In his essay, Psychology in Literature, Jung distinguished between psychological art, which drew on the personal experiences and complexes of the artist, and visionary art, which drew on collective unconscious sources. It was visionary art, typified by works like Faust or Moby Dick or Blake's prophetic poems, that most interested Jung because these works carried archetypal power, speaking to something universal in the human experience, resonating across cultures and generations because they gave form to collective psychological patterns. The creative process, in this framework, was not under the ego's control. The artist did not consciously decide to express archetypal themes, but rather was seized by them, compelled to give them form. Many of Jung's case studies involved individuals who experienced creative compulsions they did not understand, overwhelming impulses to paint or write or compose, producing works saturated with symbolic content that surprised the creators themselves. This theory of creativity was utterly at odds with Chomsky's rationalism, the idea that great works emerged from an encounter with a collective unconscious, that artists were channeling archetypal energies, that creative compulsion indicated connection with transpersonal sources. All of this would have appeared to Chomsky as romantic mystification, as precisely the kind of vague and unfalsifiable theorizing that modern cognitive science needed to move beyond. Yet Chomsky's own acknowledgement that creativity in the ordinary sense remained scientifically unexplained left an opening. If cognitive science, for all its sophistication and rigor, had nothing to say about what made Shakespeare Shakespeare or Newton Newton, then perhaps other frameworks, other languages, other modes of understanding might illuminate what Chomsky's approach could not. Perhaps Jung's thick descriptions of creative experience, his attention to the phenomenology of inspiration, his willingness to take seriously the artist's sense of being gripped by something larger than the ego, captured truths that formal analysis missed, or perhaps not. Perhaps Jung's theory of creativity was simply false, a projection of archetypal assumptions onto phenomena better explained by neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and the study of expertise and talent. The debate continues, unresolved, between those who find Jung's framework illuminating and those who find it obscurantist. Let us consider one more domain of comparison, the question of meaning and interpretation. For Jung, interpretation was not a matter of decoding symbols according to a fixed system, but rather a hermeneutic engagement with living material. When working with a dream, the Jungian analyst would ask not, what does this symbol mean universally, but rather, what is this dream trying to communicate to this particular dreamer at this moment in their process? The same symbol might have different meanings in different contexts, different implications for different individuals, different roles to play in different stages of development. This approach was called amplification. The analyst would help the dreamer explore associations to the dream images, would suggest connections to mythological motifs or fairy tales that echoed the dream content, would consider what psychological situation the dream might be commenting on or compensating for. The goal was not to arrive at a final definitive interpretation, but to open up the dream's meaning, to let it reveal its depths gradually, to allow it to work on the dreamer's consciousness over time. Crucially, for Jung, the meaning was not something the analyst imposed on the material, but something discovered through engagement with it. The unconscious was intelligent, purposeful, and if one approached it with the right attitude, it would reveal what needed to be known. Bad interpretation forced meaning onto material. Good interpretation allowed meaning to emerge from material. The distinction was subtle, but essential to Jung's hermeneutic sensibility. Chomsky's approach to linguistic interpretation was entirely different. When analyzing a sentence, the linguist was not trying to discover what the sentence wanted to communicate or what purpose it served for the speaker. The goal was to explain the formal structure of the sentence, to show how it was generated by grammatical rules, to articulate the principles that made it well-formed or ill-formed. Meaning, in the semantic sense, was relevant but secondary to syntactic structure. Moreover, the interpretation of linguistic structure admitted, in Chomsky's framework, of right and wrong answers. A grammatical analysis was better or worse, depending on its empirical adequacy, its explanatory power, its theoretical elegance. There was no room for the kind of open-ended, context-sensitive, hermeneutic engagement that Jung practiced. The goal was not to let the meaning emerge, but to explain the structure that made meaning possible. These contrasting approaches to interpretation reflect the broader differences we have been exploring. Jung worked in the realm of meaning, Chomsky in the realm of structure. Jung valued depth, resonance, and transformation. Chomsky valued precision, prediction, and explanation. Jung's hermeneutics was closer to literary criticism or theological exegesis. Chomsky's analysis was closer to mathematics or logic. Yet both approaches involved a kind of interpretation. Both required moving beyond surface appearances to deeper principles. Both demanded patience, rigor in their different modes, and willingness to follow evidence where it led. A poor linguistic analysis and a poor dream interpretation shared a common flaw. They imposed on the material what the interpreter wanted to find, rather than discovering what was actually there. The difference lay in what counted as evidence, what methods were appropriate, and what kind of knowledge was being sought. As we move toward the completion of this comparative journey, we must ask, what does the dialogue between these two thinkers, one who never spoke to the other, reveal about the nature of psychology as a discipline. Chomsky's cognitive revolution helped establish cognitive science as a rigorous field concerned with computational processes, formal models, and testable predictions. Jung's depth psychology created a tradition concerned with meaning, symbolism, and the hermeneutic interpretation of psychological experience. Can these two traditions coexist, or must one eventually supersede the other? The history of psychology in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st has seen cognitive approaches increasingly dominant in academic settings. With depth psychological approaches more influential in clinical practice and popular culture, Chomsky's methods have proven more amenable to integration with neuroscience, more compatible with the experimental methods of contemporary cognitive psychology, more capable of generating the kind of precise, falsifiable predictions that academic psychology values. Jung's methods, by contrast, have remained vital in therapeutic contexts, where meaning matters more than mechanism, where individuals seek not just to understand how their minds work, but to transform how they live, where the question is not what computational processes underlie thought, but what purposes give life significance. The split between these two traditions mirrors deeper tensions within psychology itself. Tensions between explanation and understanding, between mechanism and meaning, between science and hermeneutics. Some contemporary thinkers have attempted to bridge these domains. The cognitive linguist George Lakoff, mentioned earlier, extended Chomsky's insights into the realm of metaphor and meaning, arguing that our conceptual systems are structured by metaphorical mappings that shape thought at a fundamental level. While Lakoff's work remained thoroughly within the cognitive paradigm, his attention to how metaphor structures meaning opened questions that resonated with Jungian concerns about symbolic thinking. Similarly, some neo-Jungians have attempted to engage with cognitive science, asking whether archetypal psychology could be reformulated in terms consistent with contemporary neuroscience and evolutionary psychology. Could archetypes be understood as evolved psychological mechanisms, selected for because they solved recurrent adaptive problems faced by our ancestors? Could the collective unconscious be translated into the language of innate neural structures? Such efforts at integration face the challenge of preserving what was most valuable in Jung's insights, while translating them into a framework that often seems inhospitable to the dimensions of meaning and depth that Jung emphasized. Perhaps the lesson is that we need both languages, both approaches, both orientations toward the psyche. Chomsky's rigorous formal analysis of linguistic structure reveals truths about human cognitive capacities that Jung's symbolic hermeneutics never captured. Jung's rich phenomenological descriptions of depth psychological experience reveal truths about human meaning-making that Chomsky's computational models never addressed. The human being is complex enough to require multiple perspectives, multiple methods, multiple frameworks, or perhaps one must ultimately choose, must decide whether the psyche is fundamentally a computational system to be explained or a symbolic reality to be interpreted, whether psychology is continuous with natural science or requires its own hermeneutic methods, whether meaning is a feature we impose on a meaningless mechanistic substrate or an irreducible dimension of psychological reality. The choice between Chomsky and Jung may be, at its deepest level, a choice between worldviews, between ways of being in relation to the mystery of consciousness. Now, as the comparison draws toward its close, we enter the realm of reflection, the space where we can step back from the details of theories and ask What wisdom emerges from considering these two great minds together? What do their convergences and divergences teach us? What questions do they leave us with? What territory do their combined insights illuminate? And what remains in shadow even after both have had their say? Let us begin with the question of inheritance. Both Jung and Chomsky insisted that we inherit more than just a body, more than just biological capacities in some generic sense. We inherit specific structures, specific patterns, specific potentials that make us recognizably human. The blank slate is a myth. We come into the world already prepared, already equipped, already oriented towards certain modes of engagement with reality. For Jung, what we inherit is the capacity for symbolic experience, for mythological thinking, for encounters with the numinous depths of the psyche. The archetypes are our birthright as human beings, the patterns that connect us to all who came before, the well springs of meaning that make human existence more than biological survival. To be human is to be heir to this collective inheritance, to carry within oneself the accumulated wisdom and folly of the species, the great images that have guided and misguided humanity through its long history. For Chomsky, what we inherit is the capacity for language, the universal grammar that makes linguistic communication possible, the computational system that sets us apart from all other species. Language is our birthright as human beings, the capacity that enables abstract thought, cooperative planning, cultural transmission of knowledge, the accumulation of wisdom across generations. To be human is to possess this linguistic endowment, to be capable of expressing infinitely many thoughts through finite means, to have access to a form of representation and communication of unparalleled power. Both inheritances matter. The human being without language would be radically impoverished, cut off from the full participation in culture and thought that makes us human. The human being without access to mythic depths might function cognitively, but would exist in a flattened world, bereft of the sources of meaning that give life, substance, and soul. Perhaps we need both Chomsky's universal grammar and Jung's universal archetypes, both the capacity for rational linguistic thought and the capacity for symbolic depth experience. But recognizing that both matter does not resolve the tension between them. They represent different orientations, different values, different ways of understanding what is most important about human existence. Chomsky's revolution emphasized our rationality, our cognitive sophistication, our capacity for logical thought and precise communication. In this framework, what makes humans special is primarily our intelligence, our problem-solving abilities, our capacity to represent and manipulate abstract structures. Human excellence consists in clear thinking, rigorous analysis, rational understanding. Jung's depth psychology emphasized our need for meaning, our capacity for symbolic experience, our connection to depths that transcend rational understanding. In this framework, what makes humans special is primarily our consciousness, our capacity for self-reflection and self-transformation, our ability to encounter the archetypal dimensions of existence. Human excellence consists in psychological integration, in the achievement of wholeness, in the realization of the self through the individuation process. These are not necessarily incompatible excellences. One could value both clear thinking and psychological depth, both rational analysis and symbolic wisdom, but they pull in different directions, invite different priorities, require different practices. The life devoted to rational understanding and scientific progress looks different from the life devoted to depth exploration, and individuation. The former might involve careful study, logical analysis, empirical research, theoretical refinement. The latter might involve dream work, active imagination, confrontation with shadow, encounter with the numinous. Contemporary life often demands that we choose, or at least prioritize. Academic training in psychology and cognitive science emphasizes Chomskyan values: precision, testability, formal rigor, integration with neuroscience. Clinical training influenced by depth psychology emphasizes Jungian values: sensitivity to meaning, hermeneutic skill, capacity to work with symbolic material, attention to transference and countertransference. The two paths diverge, creating separate professional cultures with different languages, different journals, different conferences, different criteria for what counts as good work. Yet individuals contain multitudes. One need not be only a rational cognitive scientist or only a depth psychologist. Many people find value in both orientations, turning to cognitive science for understanding of how the mind works and to depth psychology for understanding of what their life means. The question is not whether both perspectives have value, but how to hold them together, how to move between them without falling into confusion or incoherence. Consider the question of the unconscious, which has been central to our comparison. Chomsky teaches us that much of mental processing is unconscious in the minimal sense of being inaccessible to introspection. We follow grammatical rules we cannot articulate. We process linguistic information through computational mechanisms we cannot directly observe. This unconscious processing is continuous with all the other automatic processes that keep us alive: breathing, balancing, perceiving, without requiring conscious attention. Jung teaches us that the unconscious has depth, autonomy, purpose. It communicates through symbols. It compensates for one-sided conscious attitudes. It contains not just processing mechanisms, but potentials for transformation, sources of creativity, wells of meaning. The unconscious in this sense is not merely hidden cognition, but a dimension of the psyche with its own intelligence, often wiser than the ego, though also potentially overwhelming if encountered without proper preparation. Are these two unconsciouses the same thing described in different languages, or genuinely different aspects of the psyche? Perhaps both are real. Perhaps some unconscious processes are merely computational mechanisms that do their work efficiently and automatically without needing to be conscious. And perhaps other unconscious contents are symbolic, meaningful, purposeful, requiring hermeneutic engagement rather than computational analysis. The challenge is to know which is which, when to apply cognitive analysis, and when to engage in depth exploration. Or perhaps the very distinction between computational unconscious and symbolic unconscious is misleading. Perhaps what Chomsky describes as computational mechanisms are themselves meaningful at a deeper level, are themselves manifestations of archetypal patterns in the domain of language. Perhaps what Jung describes as autonomous archetypal energies are themselves computational processes of enormous complexity, which we experience as numinous because we cannot consciously access their operations. Perhaps the gap between Chomsky and Jung is smaller than it appears, a matter of emphasis in language rather than fundamental incompatibility. But this may be too easy a resolution. Paper over real differences with a both-and that satisfies neither perspective. Chomsky would likely insist that computational mechanisms are just that, mechanisms, with no hidden depths, no symbolic significance, no mystical dimensions. Jung would likely insist that symbolic experience is just that, symbolic, irreducible to mechanism, opening onto dimensions of reality that computational approaches cannot capture. The tension between these views reflects an even deeper question about the nature of reality itself. Is the universe fundamentally mechanistic, a vast system of causes and effects with consciousness and meaning as emergent properties of sufficient computational complexity? Or is reality fundamentally meaningful, with consciousness and purpose woven into its fabric, and mechanistic descriptions merely useful approximations of a richer underlying reality? This is not a question that psychology alone can answer. It spills over into metaphysics, into theology, into fundamental convictions about the nature of existence. What we can say is that both Jung and Chomsky opened up territories of investigation that remain vital and productive. Chomsky's insights into universal grammar transformed linguistics and contributed to the emergence of cognitive science as a major interdisciplinary field. Contemporary research on language acquisition, on linguistic universals, on the cognitive basis of grammar, all builds on foundations that Chomsky laid. His insistence on taking seriously the question of how linguistic knowledge is possible, how children acquire language with such ease and uniformity, created space for rigorous scientific investigation of phenomena that behaviorism had obscured. Jung's insights into archetypal psychology created a therapeutic tradition and a framework for understanding myth, religion, and culture that continues to influence clinical practice, religious studies, literary criticism, and popular psychology. Contemporary Jungian analysis remains a vital approach for individuals seeking not just symptom relief, but transformation, not just behavioral change, but encounter with depths. Jung's insistence on taking seriously the symbolic dimensions of experience, on listening to what dreams and symptoms want to communicate, preserved space for meaning in an increasingly mechanized and rationalized world. The combined legacy of these two thinkers includes a recognition that structure matters, that we are not infinitely plastic, that we come into the world already patterned. Whether those patterns are formal rules or symbolic images, cognitive mechanisms or archetypal potentials, they constrain and enable our development. Understanding ourselves requires understanding these patterns, whether through linguistic analysis or dream interpretation, cognitive science or depth psychology. Yet the combined legacy also includes an unresolved tension about the nature of these patterns and the methods appropriate for studying them. Can everything about the mind eventually be explained by neuroscience and cognitive science, with depth psychology reduced to evocative metaphor for phenomena that will someday receive mechanistic explanation? Or does depth psychology touch realities that scientific method cannot reach, dimensions of meaning and value that require different modes of understanding? The question remains open, answered differently by different traditions and individuals. Perhaps what Jung and Chomsky together teach us is humility in the face of the psyche's complexity. Each, in his own way, revealed structures and depths that previous theories had missed. Each showed that confident assertions about what humans are, what makes us tick, what drives our behavior, were premature and inadequate. The mind contains depths that exceed our grasp, whether those depths are the computational complexities of universal grammar or the archetypal mysteries of the collective unconscious. And perhaps they teach us the value of multiple perspectives. Psyche is complex enough to require both rational analysis and symbolic interpretation, both rigorous science and hermeneutic wisdom. The failure to integrate their approaches into a single coherent framework may be not a failure of psychology, but a reflection of the one, phenomenon itself. Consciousness and the unconscious, rationality and meaning, computation and symbol, may be complementary aspects of human being that cannot be reduced to a single dimension. We live in an age that tends to privilege Chomsky's approach over Jung's, that values precision over depth, explanation over understanding, mechanism over meaning. The tremendous successes of cognitive science, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and related fields have created confidence that eventually all psychological phenomena will receive computational explanation. From this perspective, Jung's archetypal psychology looks like a relic of a pre-scientific age, destined to be replaced by genuinely explanatory theories. Yet meaning continues to matter. People continue to seek purposes beyond survival and reproduction. Dreams continue to grip us with their strange significance. Myths continue to speak across millennia. Creative works continue to emerge from sources their creators cannot to fully explain. The symbolic dimension of human existence refuses to be reduced to mechanism, continues to demand attention, interpretation, engagement. From this perspective, Chomsky's computational approach looks like an impressive but ultimately limited analysis of mental mechanisms, missing the dimensions of experience that matter most. Perhaps the wisest stance is to remain open to both, to learn from both, to recognize the value of both while acknowledging their differences. To study language with Chomsky rigor, while remaining aware that linguistic analysis does not exhaust what matters about how we speak and what we say. To engage in depth psychological work with Jungian seriousness while remaining aware that symbolic interpretation is not a substitute for rigorous investigation of cognitive mechanisms. To hold the tension between these approaches rather than prematurely resolving it. The dialogue between Jung and Chomsky, between depth psychology and cognitive science, between symbol and computation, between meaning and mechanism, continues in our own psyches and in our culture. Each of us must find our own way of relating to these different frameworks, must decide for ourselves what we find most compelling, most useful, most true to our experience. There is no single right answer, no way to compel those who see the world through one lens to adopt the other. But there is value in the dialogue itself, in the way that each perspective challenges and enriches the other. Chomsky's insistence on rigor challenges depth psychology to be more precise in its claims, more careful in its methodology, more aware of the dangers of finding patterns where none exist. Jung's insistence on meaning challenges cognitive science to recognize its limits, to acknowledge dimensions of experience that formal analysis may miss, to remain humble before the mysteries it has not yet explained. And there is value in remembering that both thinkers, for all their differences, shared a conviction that psychology could and should be more than the collection of superficial observations. Both sought deep structures. Both believed that appearance concealed reality, that surface phenomena pointed toward underlying patterns, that careful investigation could reveal what was hidden. Both were willing to propose bold theories that went far beyond immediate observation, confident that the risk of error was preferable to the poverty of refusing to theorize at all. In this sense, Jung and Chomsky were both explorers of inner space, cartographers of territories that most people never consciously examine. That they produce such different maps of overlapping territories speaks to the complexity of what they were attempting to chart. The mind in its fullness may require multiple maps, multiple perspectives, multiple languages. We are fortunate to have both Jung's depth psychological vision and Chomsky's cognitive scientific rigor available to us, two different ways of approaching the enduring mystery of human consciousness. As we draw toward the end of this long nocturnal exploration, as sleep perhaps begins to claim you if it has not already, let us rest with a few final reflections on what it means to inherit both universal structures and the capacity to transform them. For both Jung and Chomsky, in their different ways, insisted that we are not simply determined by our inheritance. Universal grammar does not dictate what we say, but rather makes possible an infinity of sayings. Archetypes do not determine our fate, but rather present potentials that we must engage and realize through our choices and struggles. The structures we inherit are both constraints and possibilities. They limit what we can be and do, but within those limits, they enable capacities that would otherwise be impossible. Language, as Chomsky described it, constrains us to certain grammatical patterns, but thereby makes possible the expression of unlimited meanings. Archetypes, as Jung described them, constrain us to certain psychological patterns, but thereby connect us to depths of meaning that give life, substance, and purpose. To be human is to live within and through these structures, to be shaped by them, and yet to transcend them through consciousness, choice, and creativity. We do not choose to be born with universal grammar or with the collective unconscious. We did not design our cognitive architecture or select our archetypal inheritance. These were given to us by our evolutionary history, our species being, our participation in the human condition. Yet what we do with this inheritance is not given but achieved. We can develop our linguistic capacities or let them atrophy. We can engage with archetypal dimensions of experience or remain unconscious of them. We can pursue individuation or remain trapped in collective identities. We can use language to clarify or to obscure, to connect or to manipulate. The structures make us human, but how we inhabit those structures makes us who we individually are. Both Jung and Chomsky, in this sense, were philosophers of human possibility. Both sought to articulate what we are in order to illuminate what we might become. Chomsky's political philosophy, which we have touched on only lightly in this exploration, was grounded in his conviction that human linguistic and cognitive capacities pointed toward certain natural forms of social organization, certain freedoms that should be protected, certain dignities that should be honored. Universal grammar revealed something about human nature that had implications for how we should organize society. Jung's depth psychology, especially in his later work, was increasingly concerned with the individuation process, not just as individual development, but as preparation for addressing the crises of modernity, the psychological and spiritual challenges of an age that had lost connection with mythic and religious sources of meaning. The encounter with archetypal material was not just personally therapeutic, but culturally necessary, a path toward rediscovering what scientific rationality and technological progress had obscured. In their different ways, both thinkers linked their psychological insights to visions of human flourishing. Both believed that understanding ourselves more deeply was not merely an intellectual exercise, but an ethical and even political imperative. Both saw in their respective discoveries about universal human structures resources for addressing the profound challenges facing humanity. Perhaps this is where we can locate the deepest commonality beneath all the differences. Both Jung and Chomsky dedicated their lives to understanding human nature because they believed such understanding mattered, made a difference, could contribute to making the world more just, more meaningful, more fully human. Neither was content with surface appearances. Neither accepted conventional wisdom about what humans are and might become. Both dared to propose that beneath the diversity of human culture and individual personality lay universal structures worth investigating, describing, and contemplating. The fact that their investigations led them to such different conclusions, that they mapped such different territories of the human psyche, need not be seen as a failure, but rather as a testament to the richness and complexity of what they were studying. The psyche is large enough to contain both computational mechanisms and symbolic depths, both universal grammar and universal archetypes, both rational cognition and mythic imagination. We contain multitudes, as Walt Whitman said, and it takes multiple frameworks, multiple perspectives, multiple languages to do justice to those multitudes. Jung and Chomsky, for all their differences, both honored the mystery of human consciousness by taking it seriously, by devoting decades to careful observation and bold theorizing, by refusing to accept reductionist explanations that made the phenomenon disappear. As you drift towards sleep, if you are not already there, let the images and ideas from this long exploration settle into whatever place in your psyche they will occupy. Perhaps Chomsky's vision of innate grammatical structures will resonate with your sense of what is most distinctively human about us, our capacity for language and rational thought. Perhaps Jung's vision of archetypal depths will resonate with your sense of life's meaningful dimensions, the symbolic currents that run beneath surface reality. Or perhaps you will hold both in mind, recognizing that the human being is complex enough to require both perspectives, that we are simultaneously rational and symbolic animals, computational systems, and meaning-seeking souls. The dialogue between Jung and Chomsky continues within each of us who takes seriously the question of what we are and what we might become. Let this story of two great minds, never meeting but each, illuminating human nature in his own way, be a lullaby of ideas, a gentle drift through questions too large for any single answer. Let the rhythm of this long exploration carry you into dreams, where perhaps archetypal images will rise in spontaneous linguistic forms, where grammar and symbol will dance together in that mysterious space where the psyche reveals itself most freely. The territories that Jung and Chomsky mapped remain open for exploration. Each of us, in our own lives, must navigate between rational understanding and depth experience, between clear thinking and symbolic wisdom, between scientific explanation and hermeneutic meaning. There is no final resolution to the tensions between their approaches, no ultimate synthesis that captures everything both saw and more. There is only the ongoing human work of trying to understand ourselves, using whatever tools and frameworks prove most illuminating for the questions we face. Jung once wrote that the privilege of the lifetime is to become who you truly are. Chomsky demonstrated through his linguistic work that we are born already equipped with remarkable capacities that make us uniquely human. Perhaps the synthesis, if there is one, lies in recognizing that becoming who we truly are requires both honoring the structures we inherit and transforming them through conscious engagement, both accepting our nature and transcending it through choice and creativity, both studying ourselves scientifically and experiencing ourselves symbolically. The long conversation between reason and imagination, between science and soul, between computation and symbol, is ultimately a conversation that each conscious being must conduct within themselves. Jung and Chomsky, in their different ways, gave us languages for this conversation, frameworks for understanding its terms, maps of territories we must each explore for ourselves. As this exploration comes to its close, and as sleep perhaps claims you fully rest in, the knowledge that you inherit both the capacity for linguistic creativity and the capacity for archetypal encounter, both universal grammar and universal symbols, both computational power and mythic depth. You are heir to all that makes us human, structured and free, determined and creative, explained and mysterious. The dialogue between Jung and Chomsky, between their insights and their blindnesses, their agreements and their contradictions, continues wherever human beings pause to ask who they are, what drives them, what they might become. In your dreams tonight, perhaps languages will form and archetypes will appear, and in the mysterious synthesis that only the unconscious can achieve, something new will emerge, something neither Jung nor Chomsky predicted, but that their combined legacy makes possible. Let your mind rest now, wanderer, having traveled through these long reflections on structure and symbol, grammar and archetype, reason and depth. Tomorrow you will wake to the part, world's demands, to surfaces and practicalities, to tasks and conversations. But tonight, in this liminal space between waking and sleeping, between thinking and dreaming, you have encountered two great visions of what dwells within us all, two maps of inner territory, two languages for the mystery of human consciousness. Neither Jung nor Chomsky had the final word, for there is no final word where the human psyche is concerned. There is only the ongoing exploration, the continued dialogue, the never-ending work of trying to understand ourselves more fully. May this night's journey through their ideas and their differences enrich your own self-understanding, give you new language for your experience, open new questions worth pondering, and ultimately help you navigate the vast territories between computational mechanism and symbolic meaning that we all inhabit. Rest now in the space between Jung and Chomsky, between grammar and archetype, between form and meaning. Rest in the complexity of being human, simultaneously structured and free, inherited and original, explained and mysterious. Rest in the knowledge that we have within us, both the capacity for linguistic creativity that Chomsky revealed, and the capacity for archetypal encounter that Jung explored. And as sleep takes you fully, as the distinction between waking thought and dream imagery dissolves, perhaps you will experience for yourself the territories these two thinkers mapped, each in his own language, each seeing part of the whole, each contributing to our understanding of the endlessly fascinating, maddeningly complex, gloriously mysterious phenomenon of human consciousness. Sleep well, and dream both grammatically and archetypally, both rationally and symbolically, honoring all that we are.